stories about Jesus. For as much as many have taken forth to write a story, I, as a physician, am more capable of doing so, and therefore my particular story would be far more accurate, far more meaningful. So Luke is suggesting that those who are inspiring him are his contemporaries in writing biographies, and so he develops something. Form criticism helps us to detect the way in which the material develops. Tradition criticism, how stories change over a period of time. The problem we also have is this. The language that Jesus, the New Testament, as we have it, is in the Koine Greek, or certainly the manuscripts. That's like the Kitchen Afrikaans, or the Converse Afrikaans, which we have now. A very unsophisticated form of Greek. The dilemma is, this is more of the style of the language that Jesus spoke. It was Aramaic. Aramaic was the original language. We don't have manuscripts in Aramaic where Jesus speaks, or he talks, or he writes. It's not there, non-existent. And so we need to question, if that's the case, if you don't have the books in the language of Jesus, how can you then trust secondary sources? Here are two noted scholars, one's late, one's contemporary. This is an individual called F.F. Bruce. He's a conservative scholar. The one next to him is Richard Bockham. Richard Bockham and Bruce are both conservative scholars. Both Bruce and Bockham hold that, for example, when you look at the New Testament rule of thumb, Matthew and Luke base their Gospels on that of Mark. I don't know, Pastor, that you believe in Mark in priority. You accept that Mark was the first Gospel? In the New Testament, that was the first Gospel written, was the Gospel of Mark. Historically speaking, it is. And some Christians do not. But you find Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Most scholars basically accept that Mark was the first Gospel written. Or what we would call the source of Mark, which was the Urmarcus, the first source of Mark. Then you had Matthew, then you had Luke, and then you subsequently had John. These scholars, and the vast majority of biblical scholars, are coming to the conclusion that the author of Matthew and the author of Luke based their Gospels on that of Mark. But, in particular, they hold that Matthew and Luke made certain stylistic improvements to the narration. I would argue that Matthew and Luke not just made stylistic improvements, but in certain instances made changes to the story in order that you see a total evolution in terms of the development of Christ. There's something which we call a low Christology and a high Christology. You see, Muslims and Christians sometimes engage in debates and discussions. You'd have Muslims quoting all those passages about Jesus which emphasizes humanity, and then you have all Christians coming and quoting all those passages which emphasize that Jesus is God, and then we think to ourselves, what do we make of this? But it's quite simple, that when you look at the Gospels as they were written, there seems to be an evolution in the story from a low Christology where Jesus was a man to a high Christology where he was transformed and made into becoming godlike or divine. And that's what the Quran would say, the changes or the developments that took place. We look at practical examples. When we compare the Gospels, we can see how the stories of Jesus were changed to reflect a higher view of Jesus. Refer to one Gospel and then cross-reference it to another where you will find the same episode. You see, the Gospels are not necessarily continuations. They're the same story about Jesus, written about by different people, and sometimes you would have parallels. Therefore, most scholars would say that it's important you don't read Matthew, the entire chapter of Mark, but you read Matthew, one chapter, you look at Mark, you look at the same chapter, you look at John, you look at the same chapter, and you make comparisons accordingly. Is that clear? Now, look at this. We'll give you a practical example. Calling Jesus Lord. During the Transfiguration, in Mark, which is the first Gospel, chapter 9, verse 5, when Jesus was transfigured, in Mark, Peter calls Jesus Rabbi. But in Matthew chapter 17, verse 4, the same incident, Peter calls him Lord. So you see that Matthew changed the wording to reflect a higher Christology of Christ. In Mark's Gospel, he was rabbi. In Matthew, he was Lord. Same story. But Mark was the first Gospel. Matthew was later for a different audience. What about the idea of describing Jesus as Lord? When Jesus directed his disciples to wait and watch for his return, in Mark, he calls himself the master of the house. Mark 13:35. But in Matthew 24, verse 42, he calls himself your Lord. Now, what do we make of this? You see, if you look at the Greek itself, in Mark's Gospel, and I don't, probably Pastor, you understand Greek, don't you? But the word in Mark describing that particular incident is Hokirios tes oikias, which is the master of the house. He's referring to himself as the master of the house. The same incident in Matthew, Jesus refers to himself as Hokirios Haimon, meaning your Lord, something which is distinct. So there is a definite improvement in the Greek, where in the first instance he's given human qualities, in the second instance in Matthew there is a development. Can you see? There's certainly a change in terms of how the narratives are there. Now the question we need to ask is, in that instance, did Matthew and Mark really use the same words, and did they really communicate the same concept? Is the following words, the master of the house and your Lord, is the same? Or do they mean two separate things? But can you see the change? Can you see the transition? Another passage about Jesus being called the Son of God in Mark 8:27, verse 29. At a place called Caesarea Philippi, Jesus asks Peter who he thought he was, and Mark, Peter replied, "You are the Messiah." But the same incident, same story, same people involved, Matthew 16, verse 13, he says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." So can you see, Matthew adds the word, the Son of the living God, to the original phrase Messiah. Bearing in mind that Mark was a very first Gospel, and Matthew used Mark's account to write his particular story and biography. But Matthew and Luke makes certain additions. Personalized notions. In Mark 3 verse 35, when Jesus' mother and siblings come looking for him, he says, "Whoever does the will of God is my mother and brother and sister." But in Matthew, he personalizes the relationship. He says, "Whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother, mother and sister." What's the difference? Can you see? There's an improvement. God to Father. When Jesus was asleep in a boat, the storm rocked the boat. In Mark, the disciples awoke Jesus and with a rebuke, they said, "Teacher, don't you care that we are drowning? Aren't you worried about us?" That's the account in Mark. But in Matthew, same incident. It's not something new. It's the same incident. They don't rebuke him. They say in Matthew 14:32, "Lord, save us, we are perishing." Can you see the improvements? Now, most scholars, and that's what they did in the United Kingdom, in Europe, indeed in the most of biblical scholarship, where they engage in this form of redaction criticism. And what they go on further, reducing the emphasis of the oneness of God. You heard the creed, Shema Israel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. When someone came to him and said, "What is the first of all commandments?" He mentions that in Mark 12:29, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord, the Lord your mind and strength." Same incident, Matthew 22, verse 37 to 38. The words, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," is not there. What is the first of all commandments? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. So can you see improvements? Mark 10:18. Someone says, "Good master." Jesus says, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." In Matthew, Jesus says, "Why do you ask about what is good? There is only one who is good." So comparing Mark to Matthew, we can see how Matthew reworked the later tradition. And the difference is further pronounced in the last Gospel, in John. You heard with the passages where Jesus says, "I and the Father are one. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one cometh unto the Father but by me. Before Abraham was, I am." All the I am sayings. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All these particular sayings are not in Matthew, they're not in Mark, they're not in Luke. So that begs the question, why is it only in John's Gospel? And why is it that this evolution occurred over a particular period of time? That's something which people, and Pastor in all Humility, I am suggesting that not as a point to compare or suggest that the New Testament should be discarded or in any way inferior, but to basically accept the evolution of the text and to understand that this was part and parcel of the human condition, that these particular stories changed and evolved based on their particular period of time. And so I would also urge Muslims and Christians that even in debates and discussions, for example, understand the context. Don't just simply quote all those passages where Jesus says he's divine, or all those passages where he says he's human. Look at how these stories evolved. What about this? When Jesus faced death on the cross, as we have it in the Gospels, did he face it with a human belief that he would be raised on the third day? Or did he face it with the infallible knowledge that he would be raised as God himself? If he believed with human faith in God's power to raise him, then he cannot be God. But if he faced death with the infallible divine knowledge that he would be indeed raised, then he's not taking any risk on his part. You see, if Shabir, someone kills him and shoots him, and Shabir knows that the gun is filled with blanks and he's not going to die, then what's the point in him coming and saying, try and shoot me, I'm going to survive? Because he knows the outcome, the person is shooting blanks. And similarly, in this particular instance here, if Jesus indeed did believe that God was to raise him, he's not God, and he was God and he knew that he would not die, then there's no risk on his part. That's a dilemma we face. Now, moving on, very few people seem to suggest or understand what textual criticism is. And as I indicated earlier on, this is a situation in terms of which the person comes, he looks at the different manuscripts, and then he rewrites, selects, and chooses what he thinks is original. So what we have as the Greek New Testament is nothing more than a working edition. It's a working edition. Let's assume 20 of you write about an event. One of you is appointed to compile your notes. What would he do? What would he do? He would edit. He would select. He would choose. And that's what they basically do here. This is a list of manuscript text types. Across, you could probably see. These are the manuscripts that were found. In 62 you had 5,044. In 2005, 5,745. And these were the different manuscript types, whether it was papyri, whether it was your major uncials, whether they were minuscules or lectionaries. The problem is, up here, you've got the different editions of the New Testament. I'm not talking about the English Bible. I'm not talking about the English Bible, which is a translation. I'm talking about if you go to a bookshop and you pick up the Greek New Testament, which people would say, or many Christian fundamentalists would say, is the inspired Word of God. These are the different editions of the Greek New Testament. And what the scholars do is take into account all these manuscripts. This is the percentage of manuscripts that is used in relation to the 5,745. And you look at it, the Nestor Allen edition, 10%. Bulbers of Caliban, 10%. United Bible Society's Greek New Testament, 18%. Metzger's, 5%. Merck, 11%. Fogel, 6%. BFB, 7%. So the 7%. What does it tell you? It tells you basically that the percentages of manuscripts used in constructing the New Testament are minute little. Why? The only implication is that the vast majority don't seem to agree with each other. There are differences. This is a practical example. You've got the renowned scholar Bruce Metzger, and you've got alphabets right in the back there, A, B, C, D, and E. And what they're doing is they're basically working on the New Testament. They're working on constructing the New Testament based on, and they give numerical alphabets to the manuscripts based on their authenticity. A means, well, powerful, strong, authentic. B means weak. C means poor. D means, well, it's isolated, there are not too many, there are variances, etc., etc. And based on that, they come to a conclusion in terms of constructing what we would call the New Testament. Of the 5,847 Greek New manuscripts, no two are identical. Until the 8th century, there was not one Greek manuscript that contains the books of the New Testament as we have it in our present order. It wasn't there. The earliest completed one was in Synoptic Gospels of 835, it was one year. And so that is the problem that we have. When you look at the handwriting, as I mentioned on, the type of handwriting is in the minuscule format. That type of writing only came into existence after the 9th century. So if that is the case, how can you then claim that, look, you've got a number of manuscripts and you back up on it when only 6% of the 5,000 manuscripts dates from before the 9th century? 9th century, 900 years after Jesus. What about the Hebrew Old Testament? We're not talking about the whole Old Testament. Where do the manuscripts evolve? The oldest Hebrew manuscripts. The 10th century, the Masoretic text. Did Moses speak Hebrew? Did he speak Hebrew? He was addressing Pharaoh. Hebrew is also a Greek term. Many people tell us that if the the Jews who were slaves in Egypt, if they were enslaved by the Egyptians, they would not be speaking to the master race in Hebrew, they would be addressing them in the ancient Egyptian language. So when Moses goes up to Pharaoh, he would address him in the Egyptian language. Not in Hebrew, not in classical Hebrew, he would be addressing him in the old Egyptian language. This is someone called Bart Ehrman. I've got 2 books of his that I gave tonight. I urge you to get a copy. One is called Jesus Interrupted, from the New York Times bestseller, author was called Jesus, and the other is called Forged, Writing in the Name of God, Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are. Now, he's not a polemicist, he's not here to basically score points. He is in fact the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and he's a leading authority on New Testament scholarship and indeed the life of Jesus. He co-authored the book with the individual that you saw in the previous slide, Bruce Metzger, who was one of the leading scholars of biblical textual criticism in the world. These are the people that are actually going to the text, they're going to the sources. Not just like conventional Muslims or Christians who take things at face value, but they're actually going directly to the source to look at what these particular books say and how they say it. It's quite fascinating in the process that I found myself a topic called the lost books of the Bible. Now, these books basically are deemed as apocryphal works. You've got the infancy narratives, the Proto-Evangelion, 1 Clement, the Apostles' Creed, the books of Nicodemus, and they are viewed as apocryphal. But the point is that these particular books were in existence during the time when the Gospels were also set to be existence. So what defines one book as being authentic and what defines another book as being not authentic? We need to obviously be discerning in terms of how we deal with things. The first ever edition of the New Testament was written by someone called Desiderius Erasmus, and he used corrupted manuscripts to compile the New Testament. Because in 1516, they never had the manuscripts that we have today. It was not in existence. This is someone else called Theodore BEZA. He used the corrupt Byzantine text-type manuscripts and published 9 editions of the Greek New Testament. There were later manuscripts that existed in his time. He developed it, and on his work we find that this Bible here, the King James Version, basically developed. And the King James Version was in fact written. It was based on that. And as scholars discover, and they see, and they discern, and they make new discoveries and new information comes, you find that there is progression. In the world itself, and just tell me if this is getting too boring because we can move on as it goes on. These are the major manuscripts, the uncials, the books that are in place. Codex Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, Sinaiticus, and the BEZA Cantabrogiensis. The oldest Bible in the world is the Sinaiticus, oldest complete Bible. You go tonight to a website called www.codexsinaiticus.co.za, and it will give you kind of copies of photographs taken of the Sinaiticus, oldest in the world. And when was it discovered? In 1844. This was the individual who discovered it. His name is Constantine Fatrishinov. And he discovered it at St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai. When they discovered it, they found major apprehension in the world. Why? Because there was something like 14,800 alterations, editorial alterations, when you were comparing it to the existing New Testament. There were additional books. You find a different story of Jesus was contained. Words describing Jesus as the Son of God. You know, in the Gospel of Mark, there's a passage which says, this is the Gospel of Jesus, the Son of God. That is not to be found there. The ascension of Jesus is mentioned where? In two passages. Mark chapter 16, verses 9 to 20. Luke 24, verse 51. Both passages, the ascension of Jesus is not to be found in the oldest Bible. The reference to the Trinity, the first epistle of John chapter 5, verse 7. For there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, these three are one, not to be found in the oldest Bible. The instance of the woman, you know, the woman caught in the act of adultery, Jesus says, he that is without sin, let him cast the first stone. If you look at the King James Version, you find John chapter 8, beginning from verse 1 right up to 11. If you look at most modern translations, you'd see the beginning of John chapter 8, starting from verse 12. Verses 1 to 11 is not there. So, the point is, this is not to suggest that the book needs to be discarded, thrown away, or by it's necessarily false or evil. Not at all. What we are suggesting is that, what the Muslim is suggesting indeed, is that the Gospels as they occur are not biographical details or inspired words of God, or the Injil, which we believe in, that was indeed revealed to Jesus. We believe he was given an Injil, but an apologetic motif in order to prove certain particular theological points. Like I showed you earlier on, can you see? The first Gospel has one view, Matthew has another view, Luke has another view, John has another view. There's a step-by-step evolution. And that just simply shows how writings develop, how stories evolve, how basic versions of Christ himself developed over a period of time. That indeed vindicates the earlier Muslim position, because the classical Christians, I would call them Muslims, the Arians, the followers of Arius. They were persecuted by the Roman Church, which, when Christianity became a state religion, what happened to these people? They were thrown and butchered and thrown into the Colosseum, given to the lions to eat. For what? Just simply for their beliefs. Look at the differences between even the old Gospels, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 656, 567, 791, 1022. And these are some of the passages that are not to be found in Sinaiticus. So what do we do? What do we do? Why is it that you find additional books that are there, books which are not supposed to be there, that are not there? A total of 1,547 words are not in the Gospel of Luke, in the oldest Bible. So why are they there in the newest Bible? Omitted phrases. Anyone heard of the story when Jesus says, for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever? Matthew 6:13, not there. Luke 9:55, ye know not what manner of spirit ye are, for the Son of Man is not come to destroy lives, but to save them. Not there, not in the oldest Bible. The story of Lazarus, giving life back to the dead, that's also not there. Luke has some 10,000 words. So what do we do with this? What do we do with all this information? You see, there arose a tradition after the alleged crucifixion of Matthew, of Jesus, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels, and that was in accordance with what some of the early church fathers believed. But you open cursory reading of the Gospels. Matthew 9:9, and it speaks here in general. And I'll paraphrase it, when Jesus was walking by the way, Jesus, saw a tax collector called Matthew sitting at the receipt of custom. And Jesus, came up to Matthew and called him. And Matthew, arose and followed him, Jesus. Now, did God inspire that? Did Matthew write that? Did Jesus write that? Of course not. Because if Matthew were to write that, he would have said, and as I was sitting at the receipt of custom, I saw Jesus coming up to me, and I arose and I followed him. Can you see in this context, it's in the third person. Same with the Gospel of John. You look at John's last chapter, chapter 21 verse 24. This is the disciple which testifies these things and wrote these things. And we know that his testimony is true. Who is this we? And there are many other things which Jesus did, which, if there should be written, every one of them, I suppose that even the word itself could not contain the books that could be written. Now, who is speaking these words? And the point we are trying to say is not to mock or ridicule, but that these are human works. Fair enough, these were by pious individuals, whoever they were, trying to put forth certain points. But these are outside people, outside parties, third parties, third observers. I, we, his, I suppose. That's not how God communicates his message. The Quran says, Qul huwa Allahu ahad. Say, O Muhammad, he is God, the one and only. Or Iqra, read in the name of thy Lord, who created man out of a clot. The command is a direct command. O mankind, ya ayyuhan nas, as if God himself directly communicates his message. Here you have in the third person, and it came to pass, and so it happened. This is the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of Abraham, the son of David. I'm saying, even on the basis of looking at the text, very human in terms of its connotation. Even today, scholars are not aware of the world. Look at these origins and the timeline. Matthew at about 100, John 110, Luke 75, Mark 60 to 65. These are the dates that scholars will give us as being the approximate dates within which these particular Gospels were written. The problem is that most of these authors were dead at the time of the compilation. Again, these dates are in theory, because we don't have manuscripts as early as that. The earliest manuscript you do have is the Chester papyri and the Reliabilities papyri, which dates to about the 1st century. But if you look at the manuscript, it's a small fragment. It's a small fragment, a square-inch fragment of the earliest that we have of the Gospel of John. Very square-like manuscript that's existed. The dates are decades after Jesus passed away, allegedly. And of course, the manuscripts don't exist as early as this. The earliest that we have completed is 400 years after Christ. It's like someone suggesting that the earliest Quran we have is 400 to 500 years after the Prophet Muhammad. What would you say about that? That the earliest we have is 400 to 500? Doesn't make sense. The earliest we can go dates closely to the time of Uthman. And even the Sana manuscripts which were found in Yemen in the 1970s, and when Khartoum did certain carbon testing on them, dating them within decades after the Hijrah. This is what we got called the relationship between the Synoptic Gospels. Now, you know when I showed you earlier on the percentages used? This is the first Gospel, Mark. 41% of Matthew, or 41% of Matthew is contained in the 76% of Mark. 45% of Luke is contained in the 76% of Mark. You've got material which are exclusive to Matthew and Mark. You've got material exclusive to Luke and Mark. You've got material unique only to Mark, which is about 3%. But as you can see, this and this grew heavily from this chapter. And as they grew, they evolved. What about the Synoptic Gospels? You hear the expression that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were described as the Synoptic Gospels. Now, Synoptic because they are traditionally writing, and John is obviously written at a later time, a lot of Gnostic Alexandrianism. But when you look at these Gospels, you find certain problems. What happened, or rather, if I may ask, there's a story about Jairus. You've heard of Jairus, Pastor, and Jairus' daughter. In Mark's Gospel, our earliest account, the first account, in Mark the daughter was not dead, but in Matthew the daughter was dead. And so Jesus comes up to her and he then basically heals her, he raises her up. Now, this might seem like a minor difference, but it's highly significant. It's a matter of life and death. And if the Holy Spirit was inspiring both Matthew and Mark, what indeed was the actual version? Was the lady dead? Was she dead? Or was she indeed alive? What about this famous incident about Jesus? What did the voice of Jesus' baptism say? In Matthew it says, "This is my Son, in whom I am well pleased." But in Mark, on the other hand, Jesus says, or the voice informs, I beg your pardon, I think I got it all wrong. If you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, they all seem to have something particularly similar in terms of the Spirit that is descending on Jesus. In Matthew, it says, "This is my Son whom I am well pleased." In other words, it's a general proclamation. The voice appears to be speaking to people around. But in Mark's Gospel, the voice says, "You are my Son, in whom I am well pleased." In this case, there is a personalized greeting directly to Jesus. But in Luke's Gospel, in Luke 3:22, the passage is, "You are my Son, today I have begotten you," which again, quoting the words of Psalms chapter 2 verse 7. So the point is, what basically was transpired and what was communicated at the particular point in time. Last example I'll give you on this particular issue, the death of Judas. If you look in Mark's Gospel, Judas betrayed Jesus, there was no reason given. In Matthew, it was because of greed. In Luke, it was because Satan had basically taken possession of him. And in John, it's because he is in fact the devil himself. Now the commonly held view is that as a result of that, Judas went out and hung himself in Matthew 27 verse 3. But in Acts chapter 1 verses 18 to 19, and Pastor, maybe in all fairness we might give you the opportunity, if you want to say a few things in rebuttal and reply, we'll give you that privilege as well. In Acts chapter 1 verse 18 to 19, we are told that Judas himself, not the Jewish priests, purchased the field, and with the reward of his wickedness, what subsequently happened? He threw himself down, and his stomach basically burst open. So he hung himself in Matthew's Gospel. How is it that he basically threw himself on the ground and his intestines spilled open in Acts, as it's mentioned, written by Luke? The resurrection narratives. Who appears in all four Gospels? You see the appearances are different. In one Gospel it's got two angels. In another Gospel it's got one angel. In the last Gospel it's got a single man. In Luke's Gospel it's got two men. In all the Gospel accounts you've got different appearances in the empty tomb. And this begs the question, that if these books are indeed inspired by God, why is it that you find these particular problems existing? And it's not a question of suggesting that you need to be inspired or have the Holy Spirit or be born again to be able to understand and make a discerning analysis of this. Any person can see that these are indeed problems, and simply suggesting that one needs to be born again to be able to understand this